Hey everyone, this is Adam Bryant. I'm the co-author of a new book called The CEO Test, Master the Challenges That Make or Break All Leaders. On today's show, we're going to be talking about why a lot of the leaders think they're good listeners, but actually aren't, and it's a dangerous place to be for them. We're going to talk about the paradoxes of leadership and how you need to be as a leader and how you can be calm and confident and credible as a leader. And finally, we're going to talk about the art of simplifying complexity, which is probably the one art form that runs through all the 700 plus interviews that I've done with leaders over the last dozen years. So stay tuned.
Congratulations! You are tuned into Dov Baron's Leadership and Loyalty Show, the #1 podcast for Fortune 500 executives and those who are dedicated to creating a quantum leap in leadership. Your host, Dov Baron. He's an executive mentor to leaders like you, a contributing writer for Entrepreneur Magazine, CEO World, and he's been featured on CNN, Fox, CBS, and many other notable sites. Dov Baron is an international business speaker who was named by Inc. magazine as one of the top 100 leadership speakers to hire. Now, over to Dov Baron.
Welcome, dear friends, fans, and fellow aficionados of leadership excellence. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Leadership and Loyalty Tips for Executives. Hey, would you do me a favor? Send me a quick note, DM me on one of the big 4 social media outlets and tell us what platform you listen to us on. We want to know, are you listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google, however you're listening. Tell us where you're listening from, and also what's one of your favorite episodes, because I'm going to pick a winner from somebody who leaves us that feedback, and I'm going to offer a $1,500 prize. So let me ask you, what do you need to do to up-level your leadership? Well, let's start here. Does being a CEO mean becoming a politician, walking a tightrope between being a strong and decisive leader and being a politically correct person who never offends anybody? Sometimes feels like that, doesn't it? Well, stay tuned, because today's show, we're going to be examining if there was a real test for being a CEO, would you pass? It's a good question, isn't it? I'm your host, Dov Baron. I'm here to assist you tapping into the one thing in your business that changes everything by transforming meaning into action. Curious to know more? Simply go to dovbaron.com. This episode of Leadership and Loyalty is brought to you in part by our other podcast, Curiosity Bites. Curiosity Bites is the answer to the question, how can we bring people together who completely disagree? This is your chance to sit in on some pretty intense and often very exciting conversations. And it's exactly what your heart, your soul, your mind has been craving. It's with some of the most interesting people you could imagine: astronauts, neuroscientists, philosophers, holy people, quantum physicists, skeptics, Grammy award-winning artists. It's just amazing. Simply go to dovbaron.com and find out how you can sign up for and sink your teeth into the delicious Curiosity Bites. As always, you can find both of the shows on those usual outlets like Apple Podcast, etc. We always need your help in staying relevant, though, so wherever you're listening from, please do us a favor. Rate, review, and subscribe to the show. If you are a regular listener, big thank you to you for making us the #1 podcast globally for Fortune 500 listeners. We are honored and grateful to be cited by Inc.com as the #1 podcast to make you a better leader. Again, thank you for sharing the show with everybody you know. All right, let's strip it down and dive right in. There's a practical test for becoming a driver, yet there is often no real training or test for becoming a CEO. In fact, research shows that most people in management don't get any real leadership training until they've got about 10 years in management. That's pretty sad. The result is a tsunami of leadership books that are published every year that either pretty much say the same as all the rest, or they say very little that has anything to do with real practical leadership, and are in fact what today's guest calls fortune cookie wisdom. So if we boil it down past the superficial, what are the challenges that make or break any and all leaders? Well, let's find out together, because our guest today is Adam Bryant. He has interviewed more than 600 CEOs about the key leadership lessons they've learned. First as a journalist at the New York Times, and now in his interview series on LinkedIn that he has as part of his consulting work with Merrick & Co., which is an executive mentoring and leadership development firm. He's written a third book, and this third book is called The CEO Test: Master the Challenges That Make and Break All Leaders. He's done that with Kevin Shearer, who is the former CEO of Amgen, which has and the book has been published, by the way, by the Harvard Business Review. So, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and help me to welcome Mr. Adam Bryant.
Thanks so much, Dov.
You're welcome, mate. It's good to have you here. I've been looking forward to our conversation. I appreciate you joining us. You're a busy lad, and we're glad to have you here.
Great. Thanks so much for the invite.
Well, in the context of leadership, place we always like to start, in the context of leadership development, what's the question that people are not asking that they should? I find that people are so often focused on the wrong thing. They're looking for an answer to a symptom rather than a problem. So from your point of view, what is the leadership question we need to be asking that we're not doing yet? Or we're not doing right now?
For me, the cornerstone of the foundation, the question is your strategy as clear and as simple as it needs to be? And then the follow-on questions to that are, does everybody at your company understand the strategy and how their work helps drive that strategy? To me, that's a really simple question, and it's really hard to answer. And there is a big gap in leadership. We see this all the time. There's often a huge gap between how clear the leader thinks the strategy is to everybody and how clear it is in fact.
So let's sort of hit that head on for a minute, because again, I often talked about in these shows that there are words that are thrown around that often have a subjective meaning, and like integrity or whatever it is. And even words like strategy, it's like, well, does everybody know do you know what your strategy is? Yes. Is it clear? Yes. Does everybody know what it is? Yes. Okay. What is the strategy? And then they describe something to me that isn't a strategy. So let's hit that one head on for a minute. Like, what the hell is a strategy? Let's pretend nobody knows. What is it?
Yeah, exactly. And I just want to say amen to what you just said, because as in this new chapter of my career, I was a journalist for 30 years. I didn't go to business school. 4 years I've been consulting with leadership teams inside big companies. I kind of thought that everybody knew what strategy meant, but what I've come to understand and appreciate is what you just alluded to, which to me, I've come to realize that strategy is a Rorschach test, a classic ink blot that it means different things to different people. And the patterns that I've seen are, when you ask leadership teams, tell me about your strategy, one pattern is they go to really high altitude, sort of just with a general description of what the company does rather than what it is trying to do. I've seen strategies that basically are dictionary definitions of what any company should do. That's not a strategy. They're very safe statements. Nobody would ever argue with them, but that's part of the problem. At the other extreme, you ask people, what is your strategy? And they'll go to really low altitude, down in the weeds, give you a list of 12 priorities for the next quarter, and that's too granular. And so what I find, we try and level set the conversation a little bit, is like, let's focus on that middle band, that middle altitude. And in the book, for lack of a better term, we call it a simple plan. And there's just, we share a very simple framework that I learned from Dinesh Paliwal, the former CEO of Harman International, that just grounds strategy into a one-page, 4-part document that everybody can at least use to start a productive conversation.
So sort of quickly, as an overview, what are those 4 pieces? Just because I think we have to, it's what you just said, we have to level set this before we go any further, because it's so, as you said, like a Rorschach test. It's like, wow, are we talking about different things?
Yeah. And there's so many frameworks, right? There's KPIs and OKRs, and Salesforce uses V2MOM for vision, values, mission, objectives. There's something else. But Dinesh, when I interviewed Dinesh, and he told me the framework that he uses for his board presentations, wants it on one page. I fell out of my chair because I just thought that is so simple and so brilliant. So the 4 components, very simply, is the first one is a concrete sort of summary statement of what you are trying to achieve, right? And that word is very specific and intentional about what is the outcome you're driving towards, rather than just sort of some general direction. The second part are, okay, if that's your goal, what are the 2 or 3 or 4 levers you have to pull to achieve that goal? right? And then the third part is, okay, let's acknowledge the headwinds we faced. What are the challenges we're going to have to navigate? You want that kind of gut reality check so that everybody understands, look, we do have these challenges that we have to overcome, whatever they are. And the fourth part is like, what's the shared scoreboard for measuring progress and success? Doesn't always have to be quantitative, could be qualitative. We need to get a new product out the door by date X, but there has to be that shared external scoreboard so that the team can feel like they're winning together. Because what I've come to understand is that when you don't have a shared scoreboard, it's just human nature. Everybody creates their own scoreboard for their own progress in their own head, and they are always crushing it on their own scoreboards in their own head.
Whoa, I'm doing really great.
I got up this morning. I went to work. I'm doing great, Dov.
Why did they fire me? I have no idea.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a really great place to start. So every leadership expert could, and often do, start their book with the leadership is, fill in the blank.
Right.
And as you say, they're not wrong when they do that, but leadership is a massive subject. How did you put together a framework for the book, for the CEO test that didn't just go, oh, well, leadership is, like you and I talked about last time, leadership is communication, or leadership is, creating a vision. I mean, leadership is, okay. So how did you go, that's a massive, massive ocean that we've got to get into a teacup. How did you do that? What was the way you framed it up?
Yeah, and I've spent about a dozen years now really thinking long and hard about leadership. And sometimes it takes you that long to realize things that maybe in hindsight are obvious. So, for the book, we talk about in the introduction, let's be clear about what we're talking about and what we're not talking about. Because as you said, I mean, leadership is about everything, right? You can finish that leadership is about sentence with 300 different things. And as I like to say, you're probably not going to be wrong in what you say, but just because something isn't wrong doesn't mean it is an insight, right? Because there's a lot of leadership advice that's really just sort of platitudes and statements of the obvious. There's a lot of leadership advice that is very academic and theoretical and may make sense until you introduce actual human beings into the equation, right? Or there's often, case studies, this worked for, this is a great leadership lesson in this context, but not for others. You just sort of, I needed to get very clear in my mind what we were not talking about. I think there's also this, you see a lot of people wanting to coin a new phrase. Let's add a new adjective in front of the word leadership, and that's the new thing. And so it'll be positive leadership, like as opposed to what? Whenever I hear these phrases, and even with servant leadership, I find myself a little bit skeptical, like as opposed to what? And so our focus with this book.
By the way, that's really good. As opposed to what? As opposed to douchey leadership?
Positive leadership as opposed to negative, like there's
positive leadership. Well, let's do negative leadership. Servant leadership as opposed to what? Slavery?
Right. And we all know the Bob Dylan song, you got to serve somebody. So isn't that redundant? Right. So let's sort of be clear about that. So when Kevin and I sat down to write this book, we wanted to be super clear on the framework, and it really is captured in the subtitle, which is what are the challenges that make or break all leaders, not just CEOs. What can we learn from CEOs? That's why it's called the CEO test. But why do all leaders, what are the important reasons that help explain why people succeed or fail in these roles? And then ... can we also provide something of a playbook to show people how to actually do it? So there is that sort of practical insight, those takeaways. Here are some tools that companies use. So you're not just sort of pointing out a challenge, but actually bringing a tow truck to the challenge.
Well, one of the things you just said is that obviously the book is called The CEO Test, but it's not just about CEOs. So let's sort of nail on that for a minute, which is, how are you defining leader? Because I think that's another one of those things like, oh, everybody's a leader. Well, I don't know. Some people think. So how are you defining leader in this context?
Yeah, and to provide a bit of context, I mean, I've often been struck, like I've interviewed, by now more than 700 CEOs, and I've really come to appreciate that society looks at CEOs as if they were a subspecies of the human race, right? Like, oh, they're different, and let's study their brains and how do their brains work and do heat maps of their brains and all that. And it's like, no, they're just people who got into these jobs because they did their previous jobs well. So we wanted to sort of reverse the lens a little bit and ask the question, in what way is the CEO's job similar to the job of somebody who's leading a team of 10 people, who's like a middle manager? Because, by focusing on that way, you take all of the stuff off the table that is unique to the CEO role, and then say, what are the common challenges that everybody shares? And one of the other things that I've really come to appreciate in the consulting chapter of my career is you go inside big companies, and there are very often like stratified conversations about leadership based on title and rank. Mm-hmm. It's like, well, you're an SVP, so we're gonna have this conversation about leadership for you, and it's a different. And I've always struck, like, why is that? Because when you set that up and you go, okay, here's an offsite, here's a workshop, you say, well, that was really interesting, and you go back to your desk and nobody ever talks about it again. And so what struck Kevin and I is like, there really should be a shared language about leadership from the CEO all the way down that people talk about in meetings, right? To in effect give frameworks and handles for having the conversations about the challenges that leaders face, rather than, oh, that was a really inspiring talk I just heard. So that was the sort of our approach to getting at this conversation, which I know it's a little bit, it's a little bit of an interesting signal in the title of CEO. It's not just for CEOs, but the idea is from the CEO on down, what are the shared challenges? And then what can we learn from CEOs about how to win at those challenges?
But one of the things I like about it is it's removing the grandiosity, and I think that we do that. We give somebody a position and we hold them in a level of grandiosity. They're untouchable. And so there are conversations that are taking place in that grandiosity that are not taking place at other levels. And as I said in the intro, people are 10 years into management before they get any leadership training, and then it's insufficient. And that's me being kind. It's often useless.
Right.
Let's get down to a little bit of that. What are some of these common challenges that make or break any leader?
Sure. So I think another big one is just this idea of who is on their team, right? Because you're only going to be as good as your team. And I think we're starting to let go of the notion of like the superhero CEO is going to figure everything out and everything's going to be magic. Boards are increasingly appreciating that it's not like the CEO is just one player on the team. They've got to have a good team around them. But in all the mentoring work that we do with C-suite executives, we will often ask leaders, like, tell us about your team. And they'll start saying, oh, Joe or Jane, they're loyal. They've been with the company for a long time. They're really good glue for the team. And we sort of stop the conversation and say, well, let's talk about their performance. And what happens, there's this dynamic that, and it's totally understandable, right? It's human nature. Very often you've hired people, you spend more time with them than you do your spouse or your partner, your boyfriend and girlfriend. And you just start saying, okay, like, maybe they're not working at a super high level, and then you create the narrative, and that is a slippery slope. So point one is just to sort of really create a clear standard in your head for what good looks like. And I often think about Ron Williams, who was the former CEO of Aetna, and he had this simple rule for his leadership team. He said, everybody needs to be getting 15% better every year. And I love the specificity of that number, because maybe 10% feels too low, maybe 20% is too much of a stretch. But so to me, like, setting that standard and being pretty adamant and being clear about what that standard is, so people aren't just feeling like, okay, you like chocolate or vanilla today. So that's point one. So we do set out 4 simple questions for teams that leaders need to ask themselves. So one is like, why are you a team? And that may seem self-evident, but ultimately the answer to that question is reflected in the agenda that comes out for those team meetings. Because to me, there's only one right answer to that question, which is, to accomplish things that we can only accomplish together as a team. Because as you know, Dov, like a lot of those executive team meetings, they just go around the horn and people report out to the CEO what they're working on, right? While everybody's waiting their turn and looking at their phone under the table. So the first question is, why are we a team? The second question is, who should be on the team? Which I just talked about. The third question is like, how are we going to act as a team? This idea of creating a social contract among the team so that you create your own norms of behaviors, your values. Yes, there may be the overall company values, but a team itself needs to create its own social contract. And then the fourth thing is, what is the CEO's role on the team? Because we've seen too many leaders who almost distance themselves from the responsibility of setting the tone for the team. It's like, why doesn't my team get along? It's like they don't look in the mirror and say, I'm partly responsible. Right. So to me, if that's the team is so important, and really drilling into those four questions leads to productive conversations.
Yeah. So, I mean, even when you talk about being 15% better, again, we have to be careful that we don't go into the nebulous, because, well, what's 15% better? And have we discussed that? And have we agreed upon that? Because my 15% better might be different than your 15% better. And if I'm in 3 areas, have I got to be 15% better in all 3 areas? Or have I got to be 5% better in each of the 1 areas? Right. So it's, I think that that's part of the challenging communication in leadership is there's not an agreed upon narrative about something, or an agreed upon clarity about what a thing is.
Right. And if Ron were on this call with us, I mean, I've interviewed him a couple of times, and he has this great metaphor for talking about strategy, which is, he says, it's sort of like a time machine, right? Like you get in the time machine, go 5 years out, you get out of the time machine, walk around and see what the world is going to look like and how your company should be winning in that world. You get back in the time machine and you come back to the present. And I think in many ways, like it starts with that if you're on the executive team, you have to have a theory of the case, right? Of what that time machine future looks like and how you're going to work towards it. You know, when I talk to CEOs about this issue and I say, well, what's the negative of that? Like if somebody's not getting better, what does that look like? And you hear things like they're not asking for more resources, right? Or they're not ambitious. They don't have a sense of where the market is moving in their particular function. The CEO has to point out to them, it's like, have you thought about it? You've seen this thing going on over there. And sometimes people too, when they're drowning a little bit, they kind of retreat into themselves. So I think it really starts with that at the strategy level. And, I wish Ron were on the call because he could unpack that more, but I think it would start with this idea of just, status quo is not an option. So we have to be much clearer about that sort of time machine and how we're going, what that looks like and how we're going to win in that future world.
So, a lot of this is looking at not only what a leader, CEO must do, but how they must be. And I think that oftentimes leadership is seen as a doing. It's what I do. And of course, it is what you do, but how you are being is the model for leadership. So talk to us about the do versus the be, because I know that's an important part of the work.
Yeah, it's a great point. And we really used as a framework for the 7 challenges that we identified in the book. And the first 6 fall into that category of do. And the 6 are, strategy, culture, team, driving transformation, listening, and navigating a crisis. For us, those are, the 6 big do parts of leadership that help explain why people succeed or fail in their roles. The 7th chapter, which we call the Mastering the Inner Game of Leadership, is precisely about the point you just made, which is how do you be as a leader? And for me, the context starts with the simple fact that leadership is really hard, right? And one of the reasons it's so hard is that if you are moving into leadership positions and you say, I want to be a better leader, I'm going to start reading and listening to podcasts and becoming a student of leadership, you will quickly discover that there is so much advice that is just flat out contradictory.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
And you'll drown in it.
Right. For every leader who says, lead from the front, you've got lead from the back, and you've got to create a sense of
lead from the middle, though.
Right. And you got to create a sense of urgency, but you have to be patient and you got to be really empathetic, but you've got to hold people accountable, and you've got to be optimistic, but you've got to be realistic. And you can literally just keep going and fill a whiteboard with all these contradictory pairs. And I think for me, an important insight for leaders is to recognize that those or constructs are actually and constructs. And we call them the paradoxes of leadership. Mm-hmm. And once you understand, it's like, wait, this is why leadership is so hard. That once I understand these paradoxes, then it's about getting to kind of that balance point of understanding, because one of the things that struck me, Dov, and you've interviewed hundreds and hundreds of leaders too, and I'm often struck by the body language that I see in leaders and just the look in their eye, because I've done almost all my interviews in person. And I am struck by how many of them do seem calm and confident, and not arrogant, but just confident. Yeah. And I ask myself, like, you got incredibly tough jobs. Like every minute you've got 20 things coming at you from different angles. How can you be calm in that environment? And it goes to this, like, how do you need to be? And so once you understand the balance point, the center point of all those paradoxes, then you can flex depending on the demands of the moment. One person walks into your office and you need to be empathetic with them. Like a minute later, somebody else comes in, and that's when you got to be demanding and drive accountability. But just to understand, because I think a big challenge is to kind of maintain your psychic energy, because these top jobs are stamina jobs. Like you've done them, yeah. Right? Like it's not just the physical part of stamina, it's the mental stamina. And I think that starts with, like, I need a simple framework and a model for how to be in this job, because otherwise I'm just going to be like, getting whipsawed every different direction.
Yeah, I think, we as we come to the end of this part of our two-part delicious conversation, I want to come back into that piece around, where do you stand in the middle? Where do you stand knowing how to flex and be with? Because, as you said, leadership is hard. Malcolm Gladwell, I think it was, who said, if leadership wasn't hard, everybody would do it. And so it is hard, but it's almost a balancing act between those paradoxes. Yeah. And so in the second part, I want to talk about your sort of guidance around that. How do we find that balance in the paradox? And that it's not a balance that is an absolute, but maybe it needs to be different with different people. Yeah. So we want to come back and talk about that. I'm here, of course, with Adam Bryant in our delicious conversation about the CEO test, which is his new book, and published by the Harvard Business Review. You, of course, can find out more about that. We'll post the links to find the book in the show notes. Adam, before we go into part two, would you please tell our listeners, our viewers, where they can find out more about you and all the wonderful resources that you offer?
Sure. So my website is AdamBryantBooks, all one word.com. And my firm we rebranded, Dov, to the XCO Group as an executive committee. So our firm's website is xcoleadership.com.
Can you spell that for us?
Sure. EXCO leadership.com.
Fabulous. Okay. So we're going to be back in just one click. So stay curious, my friends. Stay curious about whether you would actually pass the CEO test. We'll see you very soon.